Waddled toward him, and he gave me a cold and fishy eye, then growled something. The MT whispered into my ear, "Just what in the name of the 13th sin are you, and what are you doing here?" I drew up my scaly figure in a noble gesture, and pointed towards the ceiling. "I have come from your ancestors to help you. I'm here to restore the holy waters." This raised a buzz of conversation behind me, but got no rise out of the chief. He sank slowly into the water, until only his eyes were showing. I could almost hear the wheels turning behind that moss-covered forehead. Then he lunged up and pointed a dripping finger at me. "You are a liar. You are no ancestor of ours. We will—" "Stop!" I thundered before he got so far in that he couldn't back out. "I said your ancestors sent me as an emissary. I am not one of your ancestors. Do not try and harm me, or the wrath of those who have passed on will turn against you." When I said this, I turned and jabbed a claw at the other priests, using the motion to cover my flicking a coin grenade towards them. It blew a nice hole in the floor, with a great show of noise and smoke. The first lizard knew I was talking sense, and then immediately called a meeting of the shaman. It of course took place in the public bathtub, and I had joined them there. We jawed and gurgled for about an hour, and settled all the major points. I found out that they were new priests. The previous ones had been boiled for letting the holy waters cease. They found out I was there only to help them restore the flow of the waters. They bought this, tentatively, and we all heaved out of the tub and trickled muddy paths across the floor. There was a bolted and guarded door that led into the pyramid proper. While it was being opened, the first lizard turned to me. "Undoubtedly you know the rule," he said. "Because the old priest did pry and peer, it was ruled henceforth that only the blind could enter the Holy of Holies." I'd swear he was smiling, if 30 teeth peeking out of what looked like a crack in an old suitcase can be called smiling. He was also signaling to an underpriest who carried a brazier of charcoal complete with red-hot irons. All I could do was stand and watch as he stirred up the coals, pulled out the ruddiest iron, and turned towards me. He was just drawing a bead on my right eye, when my brain got back into gear. "Of course," I said, "blinding is only right, but in my case, you will have to blind me before I leave the Holy of Holies, not now. I need my eyes to see and mend the fount of holy waters. Once the waters flow again, I will laugh as I hurl myself on the burning iron." He took a good 30 seconds to think it over and had to agree with me. The local torturer sniffled a bit and threw a bit more charcoal on the fire. The gate crashed open and I stalked through. Then it banged to behind me and I was alone in the dark. But not for long. There was a shuffling nearby, and I took a chance and turned on my flash. 3 priests were groping towards me, their eye sockets red pits of burned flesh. They knew what I wanted, and led the way without a word. A crumbling and cracked stone stairway brought us up to a solid metal doorway labeled, in archaic script, "Mark III Beacon, authorized personnel only." The trusty builders counted on the sign to do the whole job, for there wasn't a trace of a lock on the door. One lizard merely turned the handle, and we were inside the beacon. I unzipped the front of my camouflage suit and pulled out the blueprints. With the faithful priest stumbling after me, I located the control room and turned on the lights. There was a residue of charge in the emergency batteries, just enough to give a dim light. The meters and indicators looked to be in good shape, if anything, unexpectedly bright from constant polishing. I checked the readings carefully, and found just what I had suspected. One of the eager lizards had managed to open a circuit box and had polished the switches inside. While doing this, he had thrown one of the switches that had caused the trouble. Rather, he had started the trouble. It wasn't going to be ended by just reversing the water valve switch. This valve was supposed to be used only for repairs, after the pile was damped. When the water was cut off while the pile was in operation, it had started to overheat and the automatic safeties had dumped the charge down the pit. I could start the water again easily enough, but there was no fuel left in the reactor. I wasn't going to play with the fuel problem at all. It would be far easier to install a new power plant. I had one in the ship that was about 1/10 of the size of the ancient bucket of bolts and produced at least 4 times the power. Before I sent for it, I checked over the rest of the beacon. In 2,000 years, there should be some sign of wear. The old boys had built it well, I'll give them credit for that. 90% of the machinery had no moving parts and had suffered no wear whatsoever. Other parts they had beefed up, figuring they would wear, but slowly. The water feed pipe from the roof, for example. The pipe walls were at least 3 meters thick, and the pipe opening itself no bigger than my head. There were some things I could do, though, and I made a list of parts. The parts, the new power plant, and a few other odds and ends were chuted into a neat pile on the ship. I checked all the parts by screen before they were loaded into a metal crate. In the darkest hour before dawn, the heavy-duty eye dropped off the crate outside of the temple and darted away without being seen. I watched the priests through the pry eye while they tried to open it. When they had given up, I boomed orders at them through the speaker in the crate. They spent most of the day sweating the heavy box up through the narrow temple stairs, and I enjoyed a good sleep. It was resting inside the beacon door when I woke up. The repairs didn't take long, though there were plenty of groans from the blind lizards when they heard me ripping the wall open to get at the power leads. I even hooked the gadget to the water pipe so their holy waters would have the usual refreshing radioactivity when they started flowing again. The moment this was all finished, I did the job they were waiting for. I threw the switch and started the water flowing again. There were a few minutes while the water began to gurgle down through the pipe. Then a roar came from outside the pyramid that must have shaken its stone walls. Shaking my hands once over my head, I went down for the eye-burning ceremony. The blind lizards were waiting for me by the door and looked even unhappier than usual. When I tried the door, I found out why. It was bolted and barred from the other side. "It has been decided," a lizard said, "that you shall remain here forever and tend the holy waters. We will stay with you and serve your every need." A delightful prospect, eternity spent in a locked beacon with 3 blind lizards. In spite of their hospitality, I couldn't accept. "What? You dare interfere with the messenger of your ancestors?" I had the speaker on full volume and the vibrations almost shook my head off. The lizards cringed, and I set my solar for a narrow beam and ran it around the door jamb. There was a great crunching and banging from the junk piled against it, and then the door swung free. I threw it open. Before they could protest, I had pushed the priests through it. The rest of their clan showed up at the foot of the steps and made a great ruckus while I finished welding the door shut. Running through the crowd, I faced up to the first lizard in his tub. He sank slowly beneath the surface. "What lack of courtesy!" I shouted. He made little bubbles in the water. "The ancestors are annoyed, and I have decided to forbid entrance to the inner temple forever. Though out of kindness, they will let the waters flow. Now I must return. On with the ceremony." The torture master was too frightened to move, so I grabbed out his hot iron. A touch on the side of my face dropped a steel plate over my eyes, under the plastiskin. Then I jammed the iron hard into my phony eye sockets, and the plastic gave off an authentic odor. A cry went up from the crowd as I dropped the iron and staggered in blind circles. I must admit it went off pretty well. Before they could get any more bright ideas, I threw the switch and my plastic pterodactyl sailed in through the door. I couldn't see it, of course, but I knew it had arrived when the grapples in the claws latched into the steel plates on my shoulders. I had got turned around after the eye burning, and my flying beast hooked into me backwards. I was meant to sail out bravely, blind eyes facing into the sunset. Instead, I faced the crowd as I soared away, so I made the most of a bad situation and threw them a snappy military salute. Then I was out in the fresh air and away. When I lifted the plate and poked holes in the seared plastic, I could see the pyramid growing smaller behind me, water gushing out of the base, and a happy crowd of reptiles sporting in its radioactive rush. I counted off on my talons to see if I had forgotten anything. 1. The beacon was repaired. 2. The door was sealed so there was no more sabotage, accidental or deliberate. 3. The priest should be satisfied. The water was running again, my eyes had been duly burned out, and they were back in business. Which added up to 4. The fact that they would probably let another repairman in under the same conditions if the beacon conked out again. At least I had done nothing like butchering a few of them that would make them antagonistic towards future ancestral messengers. I stripped off my tattered lizard suit back in the ship, very glad it would be some other repairman who'd get the job. End of The Repairman by Harry Harrison.